Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors and contributors of Strategy Page discuss current events and other military-related topics with a splash of history. I'm your host, Dan Masterson. Joining us today is Jim Dunnigan, editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author, and acknowledged pioneer and innovator in board war games. Also joining us today is Austin Bay, associate editor of Strategy Page, military author, columnist, and retired Colonel, U.S. Army Reserves. Welcome, Austin and Jim. There's a term being thrown around, Jim, called near-peer war. What does that actually mean?
Well, it means fighting a war against someone who is armed, equipped, and supplied, roughly equivalent to the United States, and able to give the United States a real problem, in a future war or battle. Now, until recently, the only two near-peer adversaries the Pentagon considered were Russia and China. Now, Russia has already played its card. It's had a few surprises, but not many. The biggest surprise was the Russians weren't ready. They got obliterated by the Ukrainians. Now, the smart money was on the Russians. But for those who paid attention to what went on in Ukraine after the 2014 Russian, capture of Crimea and parts of two provinces in the east, Donbass, the Ukrainians got cracking, and they really got their act together, so to speak. So when the Russians did invade, the Ukrainians had already talked us into sending them more modern anti-tank weapons like Javelin, and the British and the Swedes and sundry other suppliers were quick to follow. This enabled the Ukrainians not only to stop the Russian invasion in the north, but to obliterate it. The problem the Russians had was they didn't realize how vulnerable their tanks were to top attack. This is the attack method that most modern Western anti-tank weapons use, where it basically fires its charge, as it were, its shaped charge or a metal-shaped charge into the top of the tank. The Russians are all using autoloaders. They have been since the 1960s. Now, it's been noted in the few cases where the Russians came up against top attack weapons, like there were some tow weapons in Syria, of all places, that the Russian tanks invariably went kaboom. Now, the reason for that was they put a lot of shells into the turret, including their charges, which are propellant charges, which are the really explosive stuff. The shells are fairly invulnerable or less vulnerable to an explosion, it was shocking. And the Ukrainians basically have obliterated over 1,700, well, nearly 2,000 Russian tanks so far. The Russians have run out of tanks. They have a few. They still have a few newly produced T-90 Ms, which are basically an export version of an advanced T-72 variant, which the Russian army itself uses. But they all had this flaw. Now, the Russians have been seen via satellite, apparently prepping some of their T-14 tanks. Now, this is their new tank. It's heavier. It's a unique design that everybody's talked about it, but only Russians have done it. It has a two-man crew. They sit inside the tank in a basically fortified capsule, and they control the tank remotely. Now, the Russians feel that this is impervious to top attack. They don't know. I don't believe they tested it, but they're apparently prepping some of the ones they have. They only have a few dozen to send, but they may be sending some into Ukraine because they haven't got much of anything else to send in. The other problem with the Russian tanks is that they have the same problem that the Ukrainian tanks have, but they haven't learned how to use it, how to cope with it. The Ukrainians have. They use their T-72s and 280s, which is another variant of the T-72, but only for support fire. They stay back. And if the Russians have any top attack weapons, they'll have a hard time getting a shot at the Ukrainian tanks. So the Ukrainians are aware of it. That's why they're so desperate to get their hands on Western tanks, especially Leopards and M1s. The M1s have basically practically invulnerable to most weapons, and they're less likely to be damaged, destroyed by a top attack weapon because the Western tanks use a different system. First of all, they use a manual loader, and they have very few shells in the turret, and most of the shells are in a bustle in the back of the turret, which has a blowout panel, meaning that if there is an explosion there, the panel is in the rear of the bustle, and the explosion goes backwards, not into the crew compartment. So I don't know if the Russians are trying to include this in their or anything like it in their T-14, but apparently it doesn't. It uses the autoloader, the two-man crew, which means each T-72 has to have a support crew standing nearby to the battle zone to do. That means that a two-man crew can't handle. But they haven't actually sent them in yet. They had some T-57, they're stealth fighters, which are not that stealthy, but they have got a squadron in service. And they're apparently moving some of them to the near Ukraine, and they may simply use them to launch, missiles. The Russians are running out of missiles. They've been reduced to using anti-ship missiles, which don't carry much of a warhead, and their guidance system is not as accurate as a purpose-built, ground-to-air missile, a ground-to-surface air-to-ground missile. And they're still using the Iranian cruise missiles, which are low, slow, and easy to shoot down. So, the Russians basically were a bust as a near-peer adversary. Now, the Chinese are paying attention to this, very close attention. They basically told the Russians no nukes, and the Russians cannot, cross the Chinese because what little support they get comes from the Chinese in terms of, equipment. They can't get weapons from the Chinese, but they can get a lot of other stuff. And they need that desperately because they've just announced a new mobilization, a quiet mobilization, as they call it. They're going to call up 500,000 to 700,000 troops. The problem is they can't train them adequately. They can't equip them. And they're having serious problems right now with desertion, mutinies, and people, desperately trying to get away from Russia so they don't get, mobilized. Russia has tried to use this to their advantage by telling key manufacturers that if they can deliver whatever they have to deliver, their personnel will be exempt from mobilization. Whether or not that will work remains to be seen. But the Russians are having a really hard time. Now, the Chinese are taking advantage of it in that they are approaching the Central Asian countries, the 5 stands, which are very unhappy with the invasion of Ukraine. They have not approved it, as it were. And I don't know what they've quietly told Russia, but it's apparently don't touch us. They have apparently cooperated or simply being paranoid. They've expelled several hundred thousand Russians that fled to their countries to avoid getting conscripted. They closed the borders. The only place where the people are getting through in very small numbers is the small border between Norway and Russia. At least 2 people have gotten through, but the border guards are out in force, and they apparently have orders to shoot to kill because they fired on the 2 that were known to escape. Now these border controls only make it possible for the border guards to extract larger bribes to sort of look the other way. So people will still be getting out, but like I say, even the people they get are going to be very reluctant. And they're not going to be encouraged by the fact that the Russian government hasn't got a lot of supplies, beyond uniforms and sometimes not even that, to equip them for combat. So, China realizes that if they're going to be a real near-peer adversary for the United States, they have to take a close look at what happened to Russia and see that it doesn't happen to them. Now, the main problem with a war with China is Taiwan. The Chinese are really intent on taking Taiwan, and we have basically made them more nervous by increasing and speeding up the arms exports to Taiwan. Taiwan, for a long time, had a hard time getting new equipment from us because the Chinese threatened us, with economic or whatever. Well, we've pretty much written off the Chinese as an economic partner, as have many other countries. And of course, China is undergoing a huge problem internally because of the COVID-19. A new strain is causing them, serious, losses. And they have another problem, which, they can't ignore, is that because of the one-child policy for 3 decades, which only really ended, about 5-10 years ago, and now parents refuse to have more than one child, that they're running out of a working force people at all, under any circumstances, as well as soldiers. So China may not be too anxious to step into where Russia has got their got toasted, as it were, in a near-peer war. So it may work to our advantage, but long term, the Chinese are basically drawing the stands closer to them. Some of the stands have oil, which they're more than willing to ship directly to China rather than go through Russia. Russia can't sell its oil. Russia is doing long-term damage to its economy, and the Chinese don't want to be a victim of that sort of thing. And of course, Xi, the the equivalent of Putin, because he's also made himself, leader for life. He's getting very nervous because he has one problem after another, and he doesn't want any more. So this may work out to our advantage in the short term, but in the long term, the Chinese are very resourceful, and they may come up with ways they think will get around the dark side of near-peer wars.
Austin, near-peer wars. Well, what's it all about?
Jim gave a good definition of what you see looking initially at evaluating two potential antagonists, and it is similar weapons, even in the case of Ukraine and Russia, at least fairly similar operational organizations. Difference, though, the differences, and once you begin push it, you see they emerge. And the first difference is nuclear weapons, which used to be thought of as a real differentiator. We've seen that there's a point that there's an unwillingness, or the side having nuclear weapons realize they pay a huge diplomatic, political, economic price, and maybe even a military price if they actually use the nuclear weapons. And that's something that we've talked about in previous strategy talks about reaction to Russian use of nuclear weapons in Europe, or even with a demonstration blast. But I made a little list of, and Jim touched on some of them, of potential near-peer wars. And obviously, Ukraine and Russia counts as one for at least the similar equipment, at least to start. And then I'll get into their differences. And India versus China, huge. The two Asian giants, they're both nuclear powers. U.S. versus China, Jim's already touched on that, even though there are real differences once you start analyzing it. But the question there is how big, making the assumption that China's move is to the east, in other words, Taiwan, that Taiwan puts up an initial fight. And think of Taiwan as a U.S. ally. I'll get back to that in a second. Now, India versus Pakistan used to be a near peer, even despite India's huge size. Maybe not anymore, because Pakistan is in such miserable shape, and India has been modernizing both its ground and air forces. I think Strategy Page, I'm going to give us a little pat on the back on that, has covered it well, because India's had a lot of procurement problems, but they haven't had the same kind of procurement problems that Pakistan has. But that's still a dangerous war because they both have nuclear weapons. South Korea versus North Korea. North Korea is not anywhere near a peer of South Korea. The South Korean forces now, especially if they're getting their Strike Eagles, their smart missiles, integrating their counterattack plan with the U.S., beginning to integrate it with Japan. Maybe it's already integrated, but they don't talk about it politically. South Korea can take down North Korea, but it's extremely dangerous war. And again, I'm not going to say it's peer, but it's as long as North Korea has nukes and has the potential of obliterating the northern half of Seoul, you've got a frozen war that has the appearance, bad pun, of a peer conflict. Toss out a couple of more. Colombia versus Venezuela, not as internationally dangerous, but similar forces. And just think back, 1995, Peru versus Ecuador. Peru is a regional power in South America. Ecuador isn't necessarily, but Ecuador is very savvy on the way it uses and prepares its military forces. So you ended up with a standoff. Last, and certainly not least, is Israel versus Iran. Are they both nuclear powers? We don't know. We know Israel is, and we know Iran wants to be. Differences emerge. Israel has definite strategic reach. Iran's trying to achieve it. But then Israel would have, I believe, Arab allies. I'm going to get back in. I said, remember, ally is Taiwan. Now, United Arab Emirates, for example, has got a crack little air force, excellent forces, and they're right across the Persian Gulf, or I guess it's Arab Gulf, Arabian Gulf on some maps, from Iran. So to get back to it, those are all, there's at least the first 4 or 5 I mentioned, major conflicts that will shake the globe economically, politically, and most of them risk nuclear warfare. But Jim got into this when he started talking about some of what we've seen are tactical flaws in Russian tanks. But that's not just the only thing. But there are always flaws, so there are no real peers. Somebody's got weaknesses that the other guy doesn't see, or the other guy assumes, and they emerge when you actually go into combat. How you overcome it is you have a military, logistics, and political systems that are able to adapt. That's a big differentiator. We've seen that Ukraine can, and Russia can adapt. Russia, slow to adapt. So they end up going back to World War I tactics. Also, what do you do when it comes to evaluating will? You know about the will to fight once it starts. Question, does Taiwan have the will to do what Ukraine's doing? I all but guarantee that Finland and South Korea and Israel do, the example of 3 other nations in arms, they're going to fight, and they're set up to fight. And the Russians respect the Finns, and the Chinese and North Koreans know what the South Koreans are up to, and everybody knows that the Israelis will defend Israel. So does that happen? How does that work out? We now know that Ukraine has the will to defend, and Russia has, the Russian people are not in this war. Leadership is another difference. Some of that only emerges, though, Dan, once the war starts. Competence, tactical and operational competence. We've seen a display of competence on Ukraine's part and incompetence on the Russian military's part. Also adaptability. Well, Russia is going through a place here where they claim they're adapting, but they're adapting by supplying mass is what they claim they're going to do. So finally, I get back to allies. allies really matter, because it's never really, well, it can be one-on-one, but in Russia's case, because they failed with the special operation to knock Ukraine out in 3 weeks, now they're essentially, basically facing a highly motivated Ukraine that is supported by the economies, intelligence, support, material support, and political support of NATO. And not just NATO, they've got a few other international supporters with nations that don't belong to NATO. So suddenly it's near peer. Russia has a great deal of power, far more people than Ukraine does. But when you look at all of the capabilities that NATO has, and a population and money, are they peers anymore? And finally, resources. Not finally at all. In a U.S. versus China, now China's created resources with increasing the size of its Navy, its Air Force, and it's improving its ground forces, professionalizing them, as they, at least that's been the intent. Russia was doing the same thing with their professionalization and modernization, and we see that it really didn't. It really didn't take. That's something that I doubt that the Chinese Communist Party leaders in Beijing need to consider about their own forces. But natural resources, as well as the military and manufacturing resources that are created. And one reason China is trying this, at least in the Belt and Road Initiative, to have landlines running to the Middle East, is because they rely so much on oil being shipped and resources being shipped from the Southwest Asia and Africa. U.S. can, if it were set up properly, there's enough in North America and South America that you can basically supply everything from on what would amount to strategic interior lines. But Canada and Mexico and the U.S. That's a geographic differentiator. I realize Russia, if Russia's supplying China in this war, has vast natural resources. So China could equilibrate it with a solid strategic Russian alliance. But all of these get into it when you're saying they're near peer, maybe in an initial conflict that kicks off one or an initial clash where it's one on one. But over time, all these other factors come into play.
So, Jim, what are the chances of a near peer war happening?
I think it's a lot lower now after what happened to Russia. Russia was really a wake-up call. If you think you're near peer, you'd better think twice before you take on somebody who was also near peer. The Ukrainians were not considered near peer, but bingo, as Austin pointed out, because of the support they got from NATO. And now, NATO has basically said, yes, once this war is concluded, you will join NATO and the EU, the European Union, which Ukraine always wanted to join the European Union. They were not so hot on joining NATO because Russia opposed it. This is before the invasion. But once they invaded, the opinion polls, shot the other way. They said, oh, hell yes, join NATO. And in effect, Ukraine has become a member of NATO in all but name. And in fact, NATO appreciates the fact that their people are not fighting in Ukraine. And if they send Ukraine enough weapons, Ukraine will win so far as they will push the Russians out, and the Russians may still lust, as it were, for rebuilding their empire, starting with, Ukraine, Belarus, parts of Poland, and what have you, and the Baltic states. But the potential victims are all well aware of what situation they're in, and they're gearing up. and basically telling the Russians, if you thought Ukraine was a hard nut to crack, we'll be even harder. I mean, for example, South Korea. North Korea keeps making noises about their nuclear weapons. In fact, they recently said that we will not use, as before, not we now will use the first use, of nuclear weapons. We won't wait to be attacked. So the North Korean response to that is, all right, we're going to develop nuclear weapons, which they can do. Japan can also develop nuclear weapons. Now, for years, it was a joke. How long would it take? 30 days, 90 days? Because they have plenty of plutonium. Their nuclear reactors produce plutonium. And, the joke was, well, it'll take them 30 days or 90 days. They could. And so basically one side effect of these near-peer wars is it creates more nuclear powers, which, means there's more possibility of a nuclear war, which nobody wants. But, if you have enough trigger-happy, nuclear weapons, owners, the possibility of another nuclear war increases. Now, again, people are still living in the shadow of, what happened to Japan. Those two nuclear weapons did save a lot of Japanese lives because it scared the Japanese into accepting, total surrender, which they had opposed. And for that reason, it saved the Japanese from a starvation campaign, which was already underway. They don't produce enough of their own food. They were importing a lot of it from Manchuria, from China, and we already had a blockade, as it were, which was very effective. And they would have starved if the war had gone on another year. I mean, millions would have starved to death or died from starvation, hunger-related diseases. But every situation is going to be different. The next time there's a nuclear war, one side or both sides might get, carried away, and you might have, a lot of radiation in the air, drifting, around the world. Chernobyl sort of demonstrated how that could happen. That was under, when Ukraine was part of Russia. Ukraine now owns Chernobyl. It was part of Ukraine. And it's a lesson to them, about the danger of nuclear weapons, because the basically the radiation spewed out of the one of the melting, as it were, reactors basically gave Europe a taste of radiation, because the Russians denied, but then Swedish radiation detectors started picking up large increases in radiation coming out of Russia, and the Russians had to backtrack. So people are suitably frightened if they see the impact of these weapons. Now, North Korea is a bunch of basically run by a mad dynasty, the Kim dynasty, which is starving its people. I mean, the situation's getting worse and worse up there. And people have been waiting for the break, as it were, for the government there to collapse. It still hasn't happened. It just goes to show you how stubborn Koreans can be. But the South Koreans can be just as stubborn. For a long time, they sought to make peace with North Korea by sending them goodies and what have you. That backfired, and now they don't do it anymore. They don't think in those terms. They basically tell as Austin pointed out, we are better armed than you, and now we're working on nukes, and once we have those, you have nothing. Now, that may not dissuade the Kim, government entirely, but it certainly gives them a little pause, because if there is a war, the Kims won't survive it. But that's a hell of a way to get rid of the Kim dynasty. So, again, the experience with near-peer wars, I think, has taught everybody that this is something you want to avoid. Even if you really feel you're stronger, don't do it. And in fact, back in the 1980s, I did a book with a co-author on how to stop a war, and we did an analysis of all the wars in the previous 200 years. And you can probably still find it on Amazon. It's not out of print. But we found the most common cause of wars was real estate disputes, big surprise, and the attacker feeling that they really could win when they couldn't. So it just goes to show you, people just don't learn.
Austin near peer wars, the chance of them
I
happening.
have to think. Well, you see one happening, Dan. It really started in 2014. It wasn't near peer then, but by 2022, it certainly was. So the chance of one happening is 100% right now. If define Ukraine and Russia, it's tough though, Dan, to come in and make an estimate of whether India and China is really going to kick off again. I don't think the Chinese want to do it because they have they're really trying to break out in the Pacific. The Indians don't want to do it. If we rate Pakistan and India as a near peer war, that could kick off again. It could kick off because of Islamic militancy. Kashmir is unresolved, but I don't think it's likely. And one of the things, if we go back to that January 2022 strategy talk we had when Jim and I were talking about whether Russians invade, it may have been the first week of February last year. Now I think about it. Jim was saying, I don't think they're going to do it. And I said, doesn't make sense for them to do it, but you have to look at the map and tell you what the map says. And they're setting up to do it. I mean, go back and play that up. You have to, I'm speaking now as an officer, as sitting there in the plans and operations shed saying, what do you think? And I said, you're going to have to pay attention to the signals that the enemy sends you. And but right now you don't see that signaling by India and Pakistan. I think Colombia and Venezuela, I put that in there because they have peer-like qualities, but Colombia is much stronger, has lots of internal issues. Venezuela has countless internal weaknesses, but there's an example of a danger. It is a dangerous situation between two antagonists. You might say it's going on right now at a very, very low level. Iran is tough to estimate. Based on bluster factor, the Iranians in it, Iran's really at war with what I think at one time, Jim and I counted them up. It was like 18 or 19 different nations they were having really low level conflict with. I don't know what it is now, but at the time, this was about 20 years ago that went through that little exercise, and the Khomeinis regime was doing that. It wasn't with peers. But they are in a situation where if they really are going to go to war with Israel, I think Israel has vastly better strategic and operational power, but Iran is huge. In comparison, it's be an interesting fight. In some ways, Dan, that war is already on. It just hasn't turned into the large-scale conventional or nuclear conflict it could. So what I was doing there, Dan, was avoiding giving you a direct answer because you don't know. And I don't know what the map's telling me right now about Israel and Iran. So when I made that comment last year, there were all kinds of satellite photography and very, very credible reports about where the Russians were marshaling forces in Belarus and in Russia along the Ukraine border, and even preparing. This was before the regular Russian forces moved overtly into the Donbass, which they did in the around February 20th, just 2 or 3 days before they actually formally kicked off the invasion. You could see it. The evidence was there. So, but it's go back to what Jim said. They're dangerous. They really are dangerous. And one of the reasons South Korea is on the verge of becoming a nuclear power, along with Japan, is because they take North Korea seriously. They take China seriously. And as for, that Jim said that joke, how long would it take Japan to get a bomb? A month or whatever. I remember reading, I forget who wrote it. He says, I don't know whether it was a direct quote of a Japanese defense official. The individual was not named. It was like, could you give us a week? Yes, I remember. And of course, that's cheeky, and at some level, it's a knowledgeable individual making a joke. But it's not a joke that Japan and South Korea can make a bomb if that's what they want to do. They have the technical competence and to do it. And North Korea and China have no one to blame but themselves if they do it.
Well, we'll stop there. Good information, gentlemen, and we'll talk to you next time.
Take care, guys.